on the presentation. I'll share the screen now. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, so yes, I will present my doctoral thesis today on the child labor policies in Bolivia and Peru, with a specific focus on the political strategies to address child labor in Bolivia and Peru. So my research is based on a puzzle. I would like to know or understand better why some governmental actors decide to follow abolitionist strategies, whereas others decide to follow regulationist ones, and how these strategies are being implemented. I started my doctoral program in October 2021. I hope to be finished by early March 2026. My research is mainly, I use mainly an inductive and exploratory approach. My main methodology is qualitative, so I will conduct interviews and analyze reports and documents. I will do a both national and subnational analysis. So it's a cross and within case analysis. Last year, I did a first exploratory field trip to Lima and La Paz to get to know better the child labor policy process and different actors involved, which was very helpful to come up with a preliminary theoretical framework that I will present today. And as Edward mentioned, from tomorrow on, I will be back doing fieldwork until the end of July, more or less. And I'm currently thinking also about including maybe a quantitative analysis to test my theories on a broader selection of cases. So first, briefly, why Bolivia and Peru? There are quite different, of course, and different aspects, but for my research, they are quite similar in the most important aspects, I would say. Both are Andean countries with a high percentage of indigenous populations, which some abolitionist actors might say is part of the problem for child labor, whereas working children organizations might say that this is the reason why, or at least that being part of the Andean culture, the children grow up to support the family in certain work activities. Both countries also have a high informal sector rates, where also child labor can often be found. And historically, Bolivia and Peru tend to stand out in Latin America due to their high child labor rates. And finally, and most importantly, both have, to some extent, active working children organizations that seek to influence child labor policies and other children rights. Interestingly, given or taking into account these similarities, it's interesting to see that Bolivia has been leaning more towards using a regulationist strategy, whereas Peru has been leaning more towards an abolitionist strategy. This is can be mainly observed, especially back then when Bolivia lowered the minimum age for children to work in 2014, and Peru has been promoting especially its national plan to eliminate child labor to 0% with the support of the US and ILO. But I still need to confirm that Bolivia has actually been leaning towards a regulation strategy and Peru towards an abolition strategy. So first, what is part of my analysis is to actually define better these strategies. And I came up for now with 4 different ones. First, the regulation strategy refers to the adoption and enforcement of regulationist policies. There are different interested actors that might be interested here, especially the working children organizations, the private sector as well. They might not do it because of children's rights protection, but because of economic interest. They might also tend to support the regulational strategy, and international and local NGOs and governmental actors. Here, the goals of this regulational strategy, of course, there are several different demands and goals of regulationist actors. I tried to limit it to the most important ones, but this whole concept can also be, again, adapted while doing field research and talking to different actors again. So for now, as the most important goal, I would say, is regarding the minimum age. The regulationist actors seek to either abolish or decrease or prevent the increase of the minimum age to work. and especially the working children organizations might seek to increase the presence of working children organizations and regulations actors in governmental spaces. Regarding the abolitionist strategy, it refers to the adoption and enforcement of abolitionist policies. Interested actors might be the ILO, the US, private sector, trade unions, international and local NGOs, and governmental actors. And here, contrary to the regulationist goals, they would like to increase or prevent the decrease of the minimum age and would support more an adult-centered approach. Then the last two strategies refers to the enforcement level and not the adoption level. So for instance, forbearance refers to the intentional non-enforcement. An example would be, for instance, if an inspector goes and finds that a child, for instance, below the minimum age is working, it should remove the child from the work activity. But if they decide that it is not in the best interest of the child to remove it from work, they might not remove the child from work, and therefore we could observe an intentional non-enforcement of the existing policies. Interested actors might be working children organizations, private sector as well, different international local NGOs and governmental actors, and the goals is kind of a mix of the regulationist and abolitionist goals. And finally, a standoffish strategy is also a non-enforcement of the policies, but mainly because there's an indifference towards child labor issue. Interested actors might be the private sector and also the governmental actors. And the goals are mainly for the governmental actors, personal gains, for instance, through bribes, and the private sector might do it because of economic interest. So in order to differentiate these different strategies and how to identify these, I will go briefly through the indicators that I will follow for now. So regarding the regulation strategy, I would look into, for instance, policies that have been passed or proposed that seek to decrease or abolish the minimum age. You might also observe a higher number of authorization and registration of children to work below the international recognized minimum age. And we might also see the formal presence of working children in governmental spaces. The abolitionist strategy is basically the other way around. We would look into policies that seek to increase the minimum age or prevent the decrease of it. You would observe a higher number of labor inspections, complaints filed, and penalties issued on child labor. And very likely we will not see working children organizations in governmental spaces. And finally, forbearance strategy. Depends what kind of legislative framework we have. Just to give an example, if we have an abolitionist legislative framework, which in the end is not being implemented, we would observe the forbearance strategy by still finding the registration and authorization of children to work below the minimum age, less and no reports and responses on child labor by inspectors and other bureaucrats, and the informal presence of working children in governmental spaces. And finally, the standoffish strategy, it's quite similar. We would see less and no reports and responses on child labor by inspectors and other bureaucrats, less and no authorizations and registrations of children to work, and no or very limited presence of non-governmental actors. So once that I have these, once I have classified, for instance, Bolivia and Peru as either one of these, using either one of these strategies, I also, the next step is to identify what influences the usage of these strategies. By looking into different literature on, for instance, institutional weakness or social mobilization and enforcement of policies, I found different variables that might influence these strategies. For example, human and audience cost. So human cost would be, for instance, if governmental actors fear that by passing a specific law, they might face social disruption. There would be a human cost, and audience cost would be if they might fear international outcry by passing a specific law, which also happened, for instance, with Bolivia. Another important influence is the linkages between the governmental actors and societal actors, the mobilization of societal actors. What's very important is whether, especially local state actors and central state actors, whether they have the same interests and want to use the same approach to address child labor. And finally, usually also important in Latin America, is the lack of political will and administrative resources to implement policies. So how could this look like if we want to see the influences of these variables towards the strategies? I came up with different examples of different settings that could explain the strategy being used. This is quite preliminary, and the goal is to make it as general as possible as well, so it can be applied to different cases. But for instance, the first setting is more or less based on the case of Bolivia. We have a country that has, to some extent, it has high child labor rates, and all actors that might have an interest in child labor policies are present or have, to some extent, an influence. These actors' interests clash with each other, although they all officially, or most of them officially at least, support children's rights protections. They might want to reach those goals by different means. So, for instance, the working children organizations would like to protect children's rights by making sure that all children have protection. And the abolitionist actors might want to do so by abolishing child labor. And other interests are also the economic interests especially from private sector in the US. These actors might use and apply different mobilization strategies to reach their interests, ranging from protest to civil disobedience, lobbying, financial resources, and the presence in governmental committees. But finally, the most important determinant is how governmental actors, the governmental actors' interest, and also how they respond to these situations. If they fear more a social disruption than international outcry or economic consequences, we would expect a regulationist strategy to be the outcome. It's just the other way around with the abolitionist strategy. Here, a difference is mainly on, or the most important difference is on, again, the governmental actors' interest. If they fear more international outcry and economic consequences than a social disruption, or care more about it at least, then we would very likely see an abolition strategy as the outcome. And lastly, I tried to also take into account, for instance, the case of the US, which has been recently very interesting, where we see a strong presence and important influence of the private sector. There are no working children organizations involved. The ILO has to some extent a weaker influence, a weaker presence as well. The main interests are economic interests, and the private sector might want to avoid legal consequences and make use of cheap labor. And and the potential mobilization strategies might be lobbying, financial resources, and also the presence in committees. And finally, again, it depends on the governmental actors. If they prioritize economic benefits or personal gains now and are also indifferent towards child labor and children's rights, they might seek which I would call also here still the regulational strategy. But I might need to adapt this one. It would maybe be a different type of regulational strategy. So this is on the central state level, which focuses on the adoption of policies. But then I'm also looking into what it would look like on the local state level when we look into the enforcement of policies. Here it first depends what kind of outcome we have on adoption level. If we deal with a regulationist or abolitionist strategy on the central state level, then it depends what outcome we have on the local state level. So, for instance, as an example, if we have an abolitionist legislative framework, I would say that the most important determinant is whether the local state actors and the central state actors have the same interest on how to address child labor. If not, then it depends first whether the local state actors has, for instance, a welfarist view. So basically, whether they take into account the best interest of the child. If they have a welfarist view, then it's more likely that we would see the forbearance strategy happening. Another important variable is also whether there are linkages with specific actors who are also against the abolitionist legislative framework. But here the most important determinant would be the view of the local state actors. Then if the local state actors are indifferent towards a child labor issue or might care more about personal gains, then we might see the standoffish strategy being the most likely outcome. And here it's not really necessary that they have linkages with other interested actors, but it's if they have linkages with other actors, then very likely with actors who are also interested in a standoffish strategy, which are more likely to be the private sector. And finally, if the local state actors and the central state actors have the same interests and agree on how to approach child labor, in this case, if they agree with the abolitionist framework, also here it depends whether the local state actors have a legalist view. This means that they basically only apply what is written in the law, or they may also fear individual costs, which means that they might fear getting fired if they do not implement the laws that they should be implementing. Then we might, it's very likely that we see the enforcement of the policies as the outcome. And here again, also this depends a lot on what kind of resources are available to the local state actors, but it's very likely that here we can see linkages between the local state actors and actors who are also in favor of enforcing the law. So regarding the subnational cases, the most important thing for me is to select cases where I can see a variance of the different strategies. So from the exploratory field trip that I did last year, I was able to receive some information on especially different regions in Bolivia. And I tried to take into account this information that I got. Of course, this can change again once I'm there, but for instance, the information that I received from Santa Cruz, where the private sector is strongly involved, I received information that there's potentially an abolitionist strategy being supported, whereas in Tarija in Bolivia, I received information that the governmental actors cooperate and quite well and have a good relationship with the working children organizations, which might indicate a regulational strategy. So also it could be a forbearance strategy. Lima, it tends to be more going towards the abolitionist and standoffish strategy. And Huancavelica, it might also be interesting to see in Peru, where I have received information that back then, when the national law, there was a law going to be implemented to eradicate child labor in Huancavelica, which was supposedly blocked through the influence of the working children organizations. So I decided to take these into account to basically, test the theoretical framework that I just showed to you. And just very briefly and finally, maybe a summary of especially who I would like to maybe take into account in the interviews in my fieldwork. On the central state, it would be mostly the ministries, several ministries that are involved in the child labor policies, like the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Justice, and in Peru, especially the Ministry of Women, in Bolivia, Ministry of Equal Opportunities. It might also be interesting to look into or interview politicians and from the Congress who have voted or maybe blocked specific policies. And on the local level, very important, of course, the working children organizations, the municipal ombudsman, the inspectors, perhaps also the police, and the private sector, business associations and trade unions are also perhaps relevant to interview. And this is a brief summary of what I've been doing. I hope it was not too much, and thank you very much for listening.